Created live on Fireside.
Welcome. I'm Lori Lee Binstock, and this is a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. Thank you so much for joining me live on Fireside Chat, where you can be a part of the conversation as my virtual audience. I am your host, Lori Lee Binstock. Everyone has an opportunity to ask questions or our guest questions by requesting to hop on stage or sending a message in the chat box. Today's guest is John Bernardo. John is an award-winning film and video director, producer with over 20 years of experience in the industry, specializing in documentary film and digital docu-series. John has produced a variety of long-form content, television integrations, and web series that have aired on AMC, ESPN, NBCU, and Sundance TV. His most recent film is the documentary A Peloton of One, which follows Dave Ohlmuller, a survivor of childhood sexual abuse by a priest, and his journey towards healing. John, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Lori. Thank you for having me.
Well, A Peloton of One is the winner of the J.P. Morgan Chase Audience Award, which was given at the Greenwich International Film Festival. So congratulations on that. This documentary is about surviving childhood sexual abuse, focusing on the next chapter in the survivor's story, which happens after a victim comes forward. And this film follows David Ohlmuller, who begins a solo bicycle ride from Chicago to New York, meeting a variety of other survivors and legal advocates along the way to raise awareness on the statutes of limitations. So, John, how did this film come about?
Yeah, so Dave Ohlmuller and we went to high school together. Yeah, so, Dave and I actually played basketball together, so we hung out a lot freshman year. But over the years, he was, one of those guys in high school who sort of just faded away. And so Dave was abused when he was around 14 or 15 years old. And he didn't come forward, I'm sure you heard this story many times, until 2015, 30 years later. And so when he started to, talk about that and coming forward, he and I talked maybe around 2017, started to talk about just getting back together again, just meeting up again, classically through social media. And then he found out I was doing another documentary on Taekwondo, and eventually we got together, and he wanted to tell this story. And so it was very much privileged to be a part of that.
Wow. Did you know at the time that there was something that was going on?
No, I mean, I tell you, again, he was just a very affable, very fun guy to be with. We remember freshman and sophomore year, and then a lot of guys I still talk to in high school. When I told them I was doing this project, they're like, "Oh yeah, it was classic Dave. I didn't know if he even graduated high school." So clearly, in hindsight, something happened, and the more and he was a pretty good athlete, also a star tennis player. The guys who I knew who played that sport were far closer to him than I was. Certainly talked to those classic stories of process of getting into alcohol and eventually drugs, and certainly just falling out of society. So no, I did not know back then, but again, in hindsight, you see the signs.
Yeah, I mean, yes, you say 30 years later. I feel like this is the case with the majority of survivors. It's honestly the case for me. I'm a childhood sexual abuse survivor as well.
Yeah.
And I didn't breathe a word about it until probably more than 25 years later. It was it was something hard that I didn't realize affected me so much. Like you said, with the drug abuse, with just of course I came off as like, oh, I'm this happy person. I'm,
Yeah.
we put on this face.
Yeah.
But deep down it's killing us. Right.
The level of shame and guilt, in the beginning of the film, the co-producer Joe Capozzi is also in the film. He's a survivor. He came forward 10 years earlier than me, 2005. He's a fantastic actor, fantastic producer. And thankfully, we worked this sort of together. So, he worked on the film as a sort of mentor to Dave. My lens was really the audience, right? I am not a survivor. I did ask, my family, Asian Filipino family, very religious, still very religious, as am I, sort of permission, or at least talked about that I was going forward with this project. And, they gave their blessing. And my father really told me, you're just like the gymnast, the audience that you're trying to connect to, outside of the survivor community, of course, is the people, just like the gymnasts who want to clean up gymnastics. We don't want the church burned. We don't want, that thing to be completely disconnected. We just want this to be addressed and ideally fixed.
Right. That's interesting. I also come from a Filipino American family.
Yeah.
It's for my family, it was more like this. Their mental health is stigma. I had,
right.
Obviously, like, so I was sexually abused by my father.
Yeah.
And I feel like when I was going through my struggles, when I was going through my suicide, I've had multiple suicidal attempts in my life, including when I was living, at home. And it was like, we cannot take her to the hospital because people will talk. And that was just it's just a horrible thing. Because actually back then, in the 90s, nobody really talked about this. Because I feel like they would have been like, oh, if we talk about mental health, if we talk about all of these things, they'll think something's wrong with us because nobody else is talking about it.
Right. I tell you, Laura, I don't mean to interrupt, but there's two huge obstacles, right? In this issue. The big one, and we can talk about this one later, is, lack of institutional control, right? The ubiquity of this problem, be it the church, be it in sports, Boy Scouts, even at the home and school. So that's the big one. But, what was shocking, very early on, your immediate circle, it's that first rung. So, again, this film, there's been great films on the topic, Spotlight, obviously, Academy Award winner, but, At the Heart of Gold, talking about, again, the ULS gymnastics, Leaving Neverland. So a lot of those are fantastic. Absolutely recommend watching those. But, they really talk about up to the reveal, right? Like the bravery that got to, have this issue brought forward. What we did was take it. Then what happens after they come forward? Really, what happens, right? And the reason why I bring that up is that first circle. My gosh, what an obstacle, that is, which was shocking to hear and hear multiple times. Didn't matter what state, didn't matter what, economic lifestyle or, whatever the case may be, that first ring of validation was such a huge obstacle to overcome, especially in the minority families, which was very surprising, but understood to a degree.
Yeah. What did anything shock you about this film? Did anything, when you agreed to do this film, in listening to these survivor stories, was there anything where you were like, oh my God, I can't believe this. This is a very heavy topic.
Well, I'll tell you one smaller anecdotal story, and then I'll address that question specifically. So, as a filmmaker, so I directed this along with my regular partner, Steve Mallorca, who was the lead editor. And, he would tell me stories that we could hunker down in a dark room for, 8, 9, 10 hours. I would go grab something to eat, and we would trade and stuff like that. But we really could not do that with this film. So it was like 2 hours hearing one story, being overwhelmed, and Steve was doing the large majority of it, and he would just tell me I just couldn't do it. I had to take a break. He would just call me if I wasn't around there already, and we would just talk about anything else. We would talk about the Knicks. We would talk about anything but this, because it was, obviously heavy, as you alluded to. But I think the shocking thing for me, and it happened very early on. So like a lot of the movie obviously is based on the bicycle ride from Chicago to New York, and the commonality of stories, again, as predicted by Joe Capozzi, was just shocking. And it is everything from, the classic grooming to the self-abuse, self-medication. Mm-hmm. And that commonality of stories, again, didn't matter if you were black, white, again, whatever race. It didn't really matter what religion you're in. And it was in so many fields, and the story is almost exactly the same. You could have just rinsed and repeat a lot of them, and that was the most shocking to me. Again, the size of it for sure, but that the pattern was continuous no matter where we were. And again, we went from places like Altoona, Pennsylvania, to New York City, and amazingly, the story was very similar.
I know, and as a survivor, you're like, this is shocking. To me, when I learned, I read the book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Oh, of course, yeah.
And I just remember reading all of the symptoms of PTSD, of childhood sexual abuse. And I literally ticked the box on everything. It was like, check, check, check. I'm like, oh my gosh, These are literally textbook symptoms of childhood sexual abuse. How did we not know this?
Oh,
How did I not know this?
And I think, well, the title of the film, we talked about this online a little bit, mm-hmm. A Peloton of One. So in cycling vernacular, a Peloton just means a group of cyclists. So in a race, it's the major group of cyclists. But Peloton is just like, a pride of lions, right? Or a wolf pack. It just means a bunch of cyclists. But the notion that you're just talking about, that again, I learned very quickly, is the notion of shame, of guilt, of being alone, right? Of an island, that this only happened to you. And obviously this is unfortunately aided by people who are putting you on an island. Like, let's not talk about this. This mm-hmm. is a quirky thing that happened, and we'll get over it together, but let's not tell anybody because of shame and guilt. Mm-hmm. And so, whether they put themselves on this island or were put on this island, the notion that they were one in a billion, and obviously somehow their fault. Oh gosh, that was what was painful, right? In the editing process, that was painful in the storytelling. It was painful in the interviews to hear all that, and thus that's where the name came from. And the notion of even Dave, as you saw in the film, very much saw, even though we filmed him for about a year getting ready, for the ride physically, and what was going on with him as he's coming forward and try to move on in his life. As he started the bike ride, visually and mentally and in every way you can say, he was biking on his own. That's what he thought. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, at the end of the film, there was a bit of hope of meeting other people and finding out that there is a community, finding out, as you just mentioned, that you're not alone, that this is a symptomatic thing, because many, many people have gone through these same experiences. And obviously that's what we were trying to do with the film. It's still like, again, afterwards, when you learn all this stuff and these steps, and there's, the legal ramifications or the legal issues, you are not alone. If there's one thing we can do, is that the Peloton is big, and one really means a group of one, mm-hmm. Acting as one community, as opposed to the beginning stages, which is isolation.
Right. Well, I have to say, I did watch the movie. It was wonderfully done.
Thank you.
It was very emotional, especially you did speak to a father, whose son passed, whose son was a victim. I honestly, I'm getting really worked up right now thinking about it right now. How was that for you guys? Because that was a really difficult story.
I tell you, that is, A little more than halfway, through the journey, and a father, obviously, as I can relate. I have teenage sons now. Mm-hmm. Dave could relate. Everyone in the crew had families. Just punched, everyone had obviously empathy, sympathy for the survivors. When the father comes on, and he's a police detective, mm-hmm. Decorated police detective, and this was happening right under his nose, and such a powerful day, starting with the mother giving us a tour of the house, of their son's room. Big Philadelphia Eagles fan, so a lot of paraphernalia from back in the day when they enjoyed those experiences. Of course, he did not get to see the Eagles winning the Super Bowl. But just that conversation, with the mother, and then the sit-down conversation with the father. What a long day. Grateful to have that experience, but emotionally gut-wrenching for sure.
Yeah, it really, just watching it, it took a lot out of me to just listen to this person's story, because it's, he's also a survivor. He's a survivor of incredible trauma of losing your child.
Yes.
Being able, like, I feel that was just, whew. But I think, I felt like we learned a lot from him. It's just, immediately as when he found out what had happened to his son, that these priests had, done this to his son, when his son, he was completely like, I'm here for you. It wasn't.
Oh, yes.
It was, like most parents, I feel like we have to be quiet. And the fact that he had to lose his son then was really heart-wrenching.
There was a story that it didn't make the film, but I love to talk to it, in which they went on vacation one time, and shorten the story, but basically the father had some heart palpitation or something, and his son basically rescued him. Just got to him in time, and got him to a hospital. And this was already after the son sort of came forward. There was just a line. There was a line, where we all just cried inside. We just kept it with the families. Like, he said something to his son, like, "You saved me," and then the son said right back, and he said, "You saved me," and not too much after that, the son committed suicide. So, if there was ever any sort of notion that there is a clear form, like, oh, you would know, right? Or yes, it's happening, but it's happening over there. It's not really my thing. It's not something for me to get involved with. That's the story. And that was why it was certainly powerful to me that we wanted that story in the film, because it's like, this guy, as classic, someone you would think from Philly, from Southside Philly, police detective, hardened police detective. And he mentions it in the film. I've dealt with every level of bad guy. And he couldn't believe that was happening right there, and a level of bad guy that he had to face. And yes, I think at the same time, that's where that back half begins a lot of the hope as well, of the film, which we were trying to project as well. There are more people coming and trying to help. And it's been a while. So, like, you talked about the 90s. Joe Capozzi often talks about the early 2000s was still not an issue open for any kind of discussion, right? Mm-hmm. And then even when we began, the very early talks was late 2017. We were just, trying to feel this out. What do we do with this? We would talk to it in 17 and 18 as the child abuse project, not the child sexual abuse project. I think I heard in a couple of the other podcasts, like just bringing up that term sexual just brings a taboo out. No one wants to talk to you. Certainly no one wants to hear a fundraiser, about it. Certainly institutions put their guard up. So that's not even 4 years ago, 5 years ago. So I can't imagine what were facing in the 90s when Joe was facing in the 2000s. And again, I'm glad to do anything we can. And you're in this podcast and a lot of people you talk to, thank God we're at least able to get to this stage where we're talking to it. And it's not this taboo thing, like don't talk about it. Still miles to go, but it is a victory to be even talking this right now.
You also spoke to a woman in the film, and it was really interesting to me because she was she had a therapist who told her that this was wrong.
Oh, yeah.
And when she said, she said, well, this was my fault. This was my fault. And I think there's this whole idea that, if it's not violent, if you don't have a gun to your head and someone's doing something wrong to you, then you could have said something. You could have stopped it because they weren't physically hurting you.
Right.
And I think that's where there's so much shame in that, and shame and if it's not violent, then it has to be the victim's fault. And I feel like that's so wrong.
And certainly for, an underage person who's just trying to figure out, where everything is in the world, right? Like, you have some sense of right and wrong, but, all you eventually see is a lot of gray. And, exactly. She is talking about a grown man, fondling her in a pool. But, I probably could have got away. I'm like, oh my God, you're so, literally in the deep end already. You shouldn't be there to think that's your fault. Oh, right. And, what was big about her story is, for the survivor community, is she was the first one to stand up with Dave. She had the same abuser. So they have never met until we saw her in Columbus, Ohio. And he knew of her. They were in the same court process together, never really talked to her, but she validated this. Or she was the first one to put her hand up that I was abused by the same person, which was huge. And part of the beauty, if you will, of the film is that, we had people lined up to a degree, but, Joe and I talked for a long time. I was like, I don't know if we have enough people. We'll figure it out. And so once we started, we just put our hands up. We'll be in Pittsburgh. We'll be in Columbus. We'll be in Altoona, as I mentioned. And people came forward, thank God. And so she came forward, after we announced that we were doing the ride, as we were riding. And then I didn't even know that at the time, that they never interacted. They never met. They were in the same courtroom a couple of times, a couple of the same mediations, but they never really interacted. He knew of her, of course. He knew, and the outpouring of their discussion together was unexpected and beautiful, obviously, where he told her, without you, I don't know if he's standing there right now, because she validated the story. It's beautiful.
Yeah. And what I heard from her, and I feel like I heard this nearly across the board with everyone you interviewed for the film, was that they weren't really going to say anything until Dave said something.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's the case for everyone. Right. At least for me, when I was in treatment, I didn't breathe a word about it, like I said, for over 20 something years. And then when I finally had the courage to say it, other people said that the same thing happened to them.
Yes.
And what I found in the film, that's just powerful how one person standing up and saying this happened to me really allowed all of these other people to say, you know what, that happened to me too. Because they didn't feel so alone. And I mean, obviously that's the reason for the title, A Peloton of One. And it's brilliant.
I tell you, but even early on in the process, I'm sure you can relate also, even when you come forward and start saying, you still think you're on an island, right? Until that, even, and then you get the validation, and that's great. But, what I was grateful to help along was that he needed to actually connect, to actually be with more people, and talk to it as if he can talk about anything else, as if he's talking about tennis, as if he's talking about a movie, because without that comfortability, if that's the right word, he wouldn't be able to talk about it for more than 2 sentences, really, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And he still has issues with it, clearly. I think everyone just noticed that at the end of the movie. As most of ours, it's the beginning, there was certainly, to a degree, Dave was hoping, and everyone's hoping that at the end of the film, there'll be a, understanding or feeling that you were whole. But I think everyone understood, even Dave understood, and Joe was trying to, communicate that to Dave the entire ride. At the end of the ride, that's going to be great for this chapter, but many miles more to go. But we'll be there. Now there's a community that you can actually say, and he was a large part of that, because like you said, he put his hand up, at least 6 other people put their hand up against this one person, and other people hopefully are doing it as well. And he was empowered as well, like seeing all, so, no, I don't mean to fast forward. I don't know if you had a sequence, but when we went to the Harrisburg event, we were already past that point. And, technically, we weren't going to go back there, but we were invited. And like just going to that event, I think was very therapeutic of seeing other people, having the same charge. That was incredibly empowering as well.
Yeah. I want to talk about the statutes of limitations. You spoke to many lawmakers along the way. And what did you find surprising?
Well, I was going to open with that with your first question about shocking, but I figured I'd hold it for a little bit, for as long as I could. But, again, this was about surviving, moving forward. What happens when you come forward? And ridiculously, surprisingly, the punch in the nose is the statute of limitation laws. And so, at the time when we were doing that sort of Eastern corridor, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania were the hotbeds, at least of the attention, nationwide, if you will. If you didn't come forward by the age of 23, 5 years after legally being an adult, you couldn't take your abuser to court, no matter what evidence you had. You couldn't do it because you're 23, right? And what was fantastic, one of the groups that we were able to interview, Marcy Hamilton and Catherine Robb of Child USA, they were smart. I'll call it around 2015 as well. I forgot exactly when they started that. What this issue needs is actual data, right? Research. And so they did like a multiple year study that found out that it takes multiple years for anyone going through this level of trauma, equal to, any level of, severe strain, be it war or, that sort of thing, to come forward until they're, to their 40s, really. I forgot the exact number, but it certainly wasn't 23, right? And so armed with that, a lot of, again, great local politicians, you saw that from, Indiana, Joe Vitale, New Jersey, Christine Hale, Indiana. You saw all these people like, all right, now I have something to argue this point that 23 is kind of ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And so, thankfully, a lot of them were successful So New York, New Jersey, and even Pennsylvania were able to up the statute limit of age to 50. Again, I forget the exact number. I think it's somewhere in the 50s, which is fantastic. But then the next fight is, of course, can you retroactively, through a legal window, then try the cases that happened before that law took place? Because as with every law, even if you were able to change it, it only gets effective from that day forward. In other words, Dave couldn't go back because the law happened afterwards, couldn't go back and really do much of anything, which is crazy in itself. So thankfully, places like New York, New Jersey did give, 1 year, 2 year windows. And that's kind of a lot of what the fight is right now, which is great. But Pennsylvania, still unimaginably, has no window. Like, you can't go back. It's like, oh yeah, okay, we realized we made a mistake. Yeah, I guess statute of limitations should have been 50 probably. But it is 50 now. Like, oh, what happened to the people who abused the day before that? Oh, sorry. You guys can't do it. And then, like, even, more insane, and even the biggest, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, singular case against Larry Nassar and, the U.S. Olympic gymnast in Michigan, where he was tried. They were like, okay, fine, we messed up there. We will give a 90-day window. Like, 90 days is kind of, and then even worse, 90 days only against people who are abused by Larry Nassar. As if you're just going to deny the ubiquity of this issue. It's insane. So that political fight certainly continues.
What was their reasoning? I mean, 23. That makes no sense to me. Obviously, it took me way longer,
Sure.
just to talk about what happened to me. I was 35. And honestly, I was going to take it to my grave. But
Yeah.
why 23? Why did you figure out why?
No, I think it's a relatively arbitrary number, and I think it is, I'll tell you the real reason, which is obvious, and you've talked about it before in your podcast, but the number equates to whatever crime people in power could level it against. In other words, I don't know what 5 years. Stealing bubble gum, misdemeanor level, crimes. And so, at a certain point, this is all I kind of glean, but again, the bigger issue I'll speak to in a few seconds is that, in the beginning, like, if you don't really know, if you don't have like a study like Child USA did, then you go with the minimum, right? Well, 5 years. We'll give them 5 years, right? If it's such a big deal, they'll come forward, which is the language you hear a lot. If it's such a big deal, they should be able to come forward, not acknowledging the psychological damage, the social damage, what have you. And so the bigger issue, I know you didn't really ask this, but I'm gonna go forward with this anyway, is, again, what I mentioned earlier, there's two major obstacles. There's, what happens when you come forward, your first ring, who believes you first, who validates you, family, friends, and the like. That's obviously tremendous on how you can psychologically, society-wise, sort of move forward. But the bigger one, the second one, is institutional, right? A lack of institutional control across the board, right? Again, it doesn't matter if it seems like the same pattern, whether it's church, sports, music, school, Boy Scouts, whatever it takes, there seems to be there as well. We didn't go into it that much, but there seems to be similarly an institutional pattern to suppress any chance that this could disrupt financial, I suppose, more than anything else, proceedings in that world. And therefore lobbyists are put in charge to really prevent any flood of court cases in this area, even though it is understood that it is clearly a bigger issue. It's like, that's their relatively easy fix. Like, don't let it come to court. If it doesn't come to court, then how big of a problem is it? Like, well, you can't bring it to court because it's only 5 years. I'm not ready yet. It is a dastardly smart way of preventing, this from really coming forward. That they are the equivalent of parents, teachers, or whoever who are trying to hush it, and they're only able to hush it because everyone's on board, right? Now, I still very much believe that it's still in the level of few apples in the church, but unfortunately, the apples are way too high up that are allowing that to continue. So, I'll also say how that also becomes a problem is that by denying that there really is an issue, denying even financial, retribution, there's really no, it just started, but there's no healing process that's really happening in the way that it needs to be happening, at the rate it should be happening on any side, right? There's no healing happening with survivors at the rate that there should be. And there's no, all right, fine, I'll buy the few apples things as it comes to the church or it comes to gymnastics. I'll buy that. But those people need help. Like if that happens again, we need to put them in a place where, they themselves can get help, as opposed to let's just put them in the next parish and hope it doesn't happen again. And we'll have fun. And then what happens, it happens again. And so the institutional cover-up is obviously saving money for them, but it's just clearly exacerbating the problem.
Oof. Yeah, it's if only people understood the social impact that from one individual of sexual who's surviving sexual abuse, like we were talking about, just addiction and all of these coping mechanisms that survivors use to numb themselves because they can't speak up, and they can't find justice, or they can't find healing when there's someone out there walking around who is causing so much damage in people's lives. It just blows my mind.
I think, again, anything Joe and I and Steve were just determined to tell that story, right? That, again, even at the end of this film is the beginning of Dave's, life, this new life. Like their road, survivors' road from the day come forward isn't, yes, there should be some celebration that they've, come to meet this issue and are dealing with it honestly. But oh my God, that road, that winding, twisting, it's still full of twists, still full of winding, if not, double. And obviously, that, certainly more than me. It's just, that is the beginning of another huge tale that people need to listen to. And again, that's what this is like. We were just trying to begin this conversation on a big scale. Like, oh, I can relate to, I don't know if I can relate to all five of them. I can certainly relate to those two. And I can relate to those two. And like, oh, but we definitely have all these issues, certainly legally. And like, what is happening? It's not like, oh, great, now you come forward, let the healing begin. The healing can't even begin because there's such roadblocks, to that. At the very least is what we were trying to do.
Well, is there anything that you would like to add?
Well, to build on the momentum of at least the back half of this conversation, obviously November is right around the corner, right? And November elections aren't won. Well, certainly they're won on that day. The inroads to win those things happen now, right? And obviously there's always the big issues of, health and education and safety. I get it. But like, women's rights there, and then children's rights is what we're talking about, right? That is on the table. How can I help? Yes, watch these films, talk and listen to survivors, certainly believe in them. But if there's anything you can do, find out where these guys stand. It's 100% transparent. Find out where they stand, on this issue. Making a judgment, even if it's someone you believe in, like, oh, that's 9 of the 10 issues I believe in, this one is bad. I'm not even saying vote against that person, but get on that person and then find out why, and, you know, get that person to convert, you know, on that one issue, or vote against them because of that, you know, figure it out. But, you know, November's around the corner. If there's one thing you can do, outside of just, you know, being with us, is doing it.
100%. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for everything you do.
That was John Bernardo, award-winning film and video co-director, co-producer of A Peloton of One. Catch this amazing documentary on Amazon Prime or Apple TV, or you could go ahead and click on that fortune cookie right there. There's a link to both. Or you could just head over to tstpodcast.com. That's the letter A, tstpodcast.com. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my email list to get Authentic Insider magazine in your inbox monthly. Join me next week on Fireside Chat when intuitive soul guide Marcy Moberg joins me to discuss healing trauma through accessing your subconscious through plant medicine and dream work. You've been listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Fireside. I'm Lori Lee Binstock. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation. Take care.